Alrighty, gang. We are about to watch more of the video called This is Your Brain on Trauma by HealthyGamerGG. And I'm just gonna skip to the part that starts with what is CPTSD?
So that's a great way to start. So today we're going to be talking about complex PTSD. And the reason that I think this is really important to talk about is because it's my belief that features of PTSD are present in large percentages of the population without being a full-blown diagnosis. Now, let me explain what the hell that means. So if we look at the epidemiology, the prevalence of PTSD is about 1.5%. So 1.5% of human beings on the planet have post-traumatic stress disorder. About 0.5%, or about a third of those people, have something called complex PTSD, and we'll get to what that is. So the interesting thing is, if you look at what separates PTSD and CPTSD, if you remove the PTSD component, what is left over, I think, is actually quite common in our society today. That's why, despite the fact that only 1 out of 200 people has a diagnosis of CPTSD, it is my firm belief that understanding that component will be very helpful to a lot of the people in our community and in the world. So for me, for example, when I work with people who have other diagnoses like major depressive disorder or addictions especially,
Did he say 1%
what I found
only?
is that the more that I learned about CPTSD, the more effective of a clinician I became at treating these people. So that's why we're kind of diving into it today. And as I think a large portion of our community and people today resonate with some of the features of CPTSD. So let's start with a little bit of history. So the first thing is, like, what are these diagnoses and where do they come from? So a couple, maybe about 80 years ago, soldiers came back from war. And what doctors noticed was that these soldiers, weren't all there. So they seem to have, this brain fog. They have difficulty concentrating. They're, having, emotional problems. They drink more. They can't incorporate back into society. So the first round of doctors said, oh, this is something called shell shock. And so what they thought happened is that even though this person doesn't have an actual physical injury, the concussive blast of an explosion must have hit their brain in some way and caused damage. So, okay, the original form of PTSD was born, and we called it shell-shocked. It's because a bomb went off very close to you. You didn't actually get hurt, but there was some kind of vibration or concussive blast that affected your brain. That's the injury. It's not like shrapnel or anything like that. So no bleeding, but an internal injury. So then what happened is, as we started to work with veterans more and more and more, we started to realize that this is happening to a lot of people that weren't in the concussive blast zone. So they saw one of their friends die or something like that. They were only on the field of battle for a day, and they just retreated, but still they saw someone die, and then these people had the symptoms of shell shock. So shell shock started with concussive blast, and then we noticed that people have these symptoms but haven't experienced concussive blasts. This is where PTSD was born. So PTSD is usually an adaptation or a maladaptation of the body to an acute, specific traumatic event. In its original form, PTSD was primarily found in soldiers. So seeing a friend die or something like that results in PTSD. Then what happened is, once we had this construct, once we had these diagnostic criteria and stuff, clinicians made a really interesting observation. We see this kind of PTSD or shell shock, whatever phenomenon, in people who have never been in combat. And they're like, what on earth? They have all the same symptoms, but they've never been in combat. Then we expanded PTSD to being non-combat related things like sexual trauma or physical abuse, or even things like bullying and stuff like that. So the web of the scope of PTSD grew. We'll talk about what it is in a second. Then what happened is, a group of researchers noticed that some people with PTSD have a different flavor to it and have different kinds of symptoms. And they noticed something really important, that if the trauma is chronic, if it is consistent over time, that results in a different clinical picture. And this is where complex PTSD was born. So if we look at regular PTSD, here's the way that I understand
To
it.
speed
Okay.
it up, we're gonna put it on 125x.
So first of all, it has 3 core features. So one is re-experiencing, the second is avoidance, and the third is, I'm blanking, I can't believe I'm blanking on this. So there's lots of diagnostic criteria, but they get lumped into 3 things: re-experiencing, avoidance, hypervigilance, maybe. Hold on, I will figure this out. Give me a second, chat. The joys of Avata memory. Okay. Oh, hypervigilance. Hyperarousal is the word that they use. Okay. So basically, PTSD has 3 core clusters of symptoms: hypervigilance or hyperarousal, re-experiencing, and avoidance. So let's understand what PTSD is. So we start off with a human being who is relatively well-formed and healthy. And then some kind of traumatic event happens to them. And then their physiology, their brain, their being adapts to try to survive that thing. The problem is the way that we adapt to survive that one instance creates maladaptations or problems going forward. So let's use a very simple example. So let's say that I end up in a car crash, right? So I'm a relatively healthy person, I'm in my mid-20s, and I get into a car accident. So once I get into a car accident, there is a hyperactivation of my nervous system, my autonomic nervous system. So I have adrenaline pumping through my body, I have cortisol getting flushed into my body, and then my brain is being hyperactive, I'm hyperventilating, I get taken to the hospital, and then I end up being okay. Now the problem is that our brain has evolved to adapt. So a human being can adapt to circumstances. And what the brain does is says, hey, we almost died there. Let's be extra, extra, extra careful and make sure that never happens again. So this is where what we see in PTSD is, first of all, people will have, and then other things happen, we'll get into this in more detail, but other things happen that will kind of numb out our brain. And so then what happens is all of these experiences get dissociated. They're dormant in our subconscious, and then they will arise again. So people will have flashbacks, they will have nightmares. These are both diagnostic features, but this is what we call re-experiencing. Even though the event is over, a part of their mind gets stuck in that moment. And that part of their mind will arise and fall over time. So the second thing that happens is people have avoidance, right? So now our brain, remember, our brain is designed to help us and keep us alive. So for example, if I almost drown in a lake, anytime I see a body of water, I will get scared and my brain will tell me, don't go near the water, don't go near the water, don't go near the water, right? And you'll understand this if you've played video games, especially multiplayer video games, where you play a video game once and then you have a really bad game because your teammates are feeding, and then your brain is like, never again, never again, never again. And the thought of playing the game makes you hyperventilate and nauseous, which is why most people play multiplayer games for about 5 to 10 hours over the course of their lifetime, because they get so traumatized that they never come back, right? Same thing. Y'all should be familiar with that.
I should have stopped immediately.
So
but I kept
it'd be
trying.
I wonder if we could explore the mechanism through which people keep going back to video games that are consistently traumatic as a way to desensitize people with PTSD and actually get them to re-engage in life. That's really interesting. I never thought about that before. But I actually wonder why are video games so traumatic, but we keep going back? It's really interesting. Anyway, conversation for a different day. So in PTSD, you have a solo event, you have re-experiencing of it, you have avoidance of whatever it is, so people will avoid getting into a car again, and the third thing that you have is hyperarousal. So what happens in our brain, in our physiology, is that we wire differently. So I don't know if this kind of makes sense, but like, if I get attacked by something, my brain will be more sensitive to detecting it in the future, and I will be more my response to that stimulus will be a lot more robust. So let's say I get attacked by a dog on the street. The next time I see a dog, first of all, my brain will be able to pick out dogs out of a field of people. If I'm walking down the street and there's like 100 people in the park across the street, my brain will notice if there's a single dog, and it'll raise that to my awareness. And then the moment that I see a dog, my physiology will activate. It will go back to like being attacked. So I'll see a rush of adrenaline and cortisol. So these are the features of PTSD. Basically, I'm a normal person, I have a traumatic event, and then these 3 things activate. Now, then what happened is people noticed that, like, okay, so this is a fundamentally different picture from when we have complex PTSD, which is consistent trauma over time. So what happens when you have, let's say, a teenager living at home who has an emotionally and physically abusive parent? So this is the kind of thing where, like, it's not a single event. This is the kind of thing where it's not like, our body and brain are just adapting over the course of one day. This is a chronic form of abuse or trauma that results in a far larger scale change to our sense of self even. So what we see is in complex PTSD, we have a cluster of 3 symptoms, which are referred to as a disorganized self, okay? So this involves, first of all, emotional dysregulation, a loss of your sense of identity, and a difficulty with relationships. Now, you can see features of these things in regular PTSD. Let's actually start drawing. So now we'll talk about it. Easier if I... Disturbances in self-organization. Okay, so let's take a look. Chat. All right, so here is a person. Okay, and if they have one traumatic event, but they are relatively well formed. So what this means is they have a relatively normal life. This results or can result in PTSD, and this has re-experiencing. Avoidance and hyperarousal. And we'll get into all these, okay? Now, let's say that the trauma is chronic. So then what happens is that this person is not usually well-formed, so it changes their sense of self. And this is what we call disturbances in self-organization. So if you kind of look at this, those are the way I understand it. If you have PTSD, PTSD is happening to you. This is an adaptation, but you are sort of separate from the traumatic event. When the trauma is more constant, and when it happens earlier, so we'll get to this in a second in a little bit more detail, it changes who you are. It changes, so it's not something that happens to you. The trauma becomes a part of you. So this is what disturbances in self-organization mean. So what this means is that there's emotional dysregulation. There is disturbances in a sense of identity, and there are difficulties in relationships.
He said only 1% of people.
Okay, so let's take a quick look at something
Much
else.
more.
So I think this. So predictors of complex PTSD, the role of trauma characteristics, dissociation,
like,
and comorbid
wow, I can't believe what
psychopathology.
you've been through when you were little.
Findings largely confirm
It
earlier
always has been
research
normal for
suggesting
me.
that CPTSD is associated with traumatic events that start earlier in life
But
and
I
are
can tell you stories,
perpetrated
dude.
by acquaintances. Okay? So if we look at CPTSD, how is this different? What this means is that, remember, we're well-formed in PTSD. So we have like a random, like if I get mugged by a random person, I can get PTSD. But I have no relationship with that person. What leads to CPTSD is, first of all, it happens earlier, so our sense of self is not well crafted. And furthermore, it oftentimes relates to having someone that is close to us in life. So our sense of self really gets messed up when our parents are abusive. And that results in this symptom cluster, okay? Now let's take a second to look at the original paper on CPTSD. And by the way, if you guys want to read about trauma, the two references I would recommend is this one. So Judith Herman was the one who coined the term. And this is an excellent paper. Excellent paper. Okay? So we're going to just quickly look at this. The current diagnostic formulation of PTSD derives primarily from observations of survivors of relatively circumscribed traumatic events, right? So she's saying basically PTSD is talking about, it relates to people who have single events or circumscribed. So you can draw a circle around them. This formulation fails to capture the protean sequelae of prolonged repeated trauma. So now Dr. Herman is saying this is a different thing if the trauma happens all the time. In contrast to a single traumatic event, prolonged repeated trauma can occur only where the victim is in a state of captivity under the control of the perpetrator. The psychological impact of subordination to coercive control has many common features, whether it occurs within the public sphere of politics or within the private sphere of sexual and domestic relations. So what Dr. Herman basically noticed is that we have a group of people who are put in situations where they no longer have control over their life. And this has a different kind of effect on the psyche, right? So like if I get into a car accident, that doesn't fundamentally change like what I'm capable of doing tomorrow. So Dr. Herman was looking a lot at people like prisoners of war, where these people this isn't just a single, military conflict on a single day. This is someone who day after day is abused, and it changes the way that they function. So today we're going to be talking about that. Since then, things have evolved a lot. By the way, the other reference on trauma that I would highly recommend, we're just going to flash to it real quick, is this. So The Body Keeps the Score is a great book on trauma, but I think y'all can get a lot of this summarized in Bessel van der Kolk's awesome paper from Dialogues in Clinical Neuroscience. So this talks a lot about stuff. This talks a lot about stuff. Dr. K, 2024. Okay? So now what we're going to do is dig into what happens in trauma. So when we built this trauma guide, what we basically have, so we did a trauma workshop a couple months ago, maybe about a year ago now. And the trauma workshop was like incredibly successful. So like basically there were 200 spots. It sold out in 24 hours. And then we increased it to 250 spots. And so a lot of people were super confused, like, hey, like, are you going to do this again? Why aren't you doing it again? We realized that the demand was so high and there's no way that we can get to everyone that we actually decided to just build a guide instead. So we took the trauma workshop, which was about 8 or 9 hours, and we expanded it to like 15, 16 hours of stuff. I think maybe that's less. I don't know what the actual video size is, but we built this guide. And the guide also has meditations and exercises and stuff like that. So today what we're going to go through is some of the core features that we explained in the guide. Obviously, they're in more detail there. And we're going to focus on the features of complex PTSD. So let's try to understand what happens in trauma. Okay? Now, so we're going to start with the body. So the first thing that happens when we get traumatized is we get hyperarousal. Okay? So our nervous system changes. Our nervous system changes to be jittery. So what does this mean? This means I'm walking along and I see a... Oh God, I can't draw a dog. Okay, I see a dog. And normally, like when I see a dog, I don't have a robust physiologic response. But once I have PTSD, what starts to happen is even benign stimuli will trigger a very strong sympathetic nervous system response. So we have this part of our nervous system called the autonomic nervous system, or ANS. And the autonomic nervous system is divided into the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. Okay? So the sympathetic nervous system governs fight or flight. The parasympathetic nervous system governs rest and digest. And the simplest way to understand that is when I was in college, I used to talk to my friends. We used to have this phrase called being owned. And it's like, I just ate this gigantic sandwich. I am now owned. I can't do anything. I am GG'd. GG. And there are other times before you eat a gigantic sandwich where you feel active, you feel energetic, you feel, you feel like optimistic about the future or whatever. So our body has periods of activity, and then it has periods of rest and digest. So I don't know if you guys like, after you have a meal, what happens is our parasympathetic nervous system activates. So when the parasympathetic nervous system activates, and it's triggered by things like food in your stomach, and then our body our stomach sends signals to our brain that's like, hey, we've got a bunch of food coming in. We need to divert blood flow from our skeletal muscles, like our arms and our legs and our brain, to our digestive system. Our liver needs blood, our GI system needs blood, our stomach needs blood, intestines need blood, our gallbladder needs blood. This is where we need all of our blood flow. So we'll feel sleepy. We'll feel like sitting around, we'll digest things. And then there are other times like when I'm walking down the street and I get attacked by a thief, so if someone's trying to mug me, then my sympathetic nervous system will activate. I'll get a surge of adrenaline and cortisol, and then I will fight or I will run away. Now, if we look at diseases like anxiety disorders or panic attacks, what we see is that in these disorders, we have a hyperactivation of the sympathetic nervous system. In our society today, we have a very high stress state. And the reason for that is that generally speaking, the sympathetic nervous system was something that was supposed to turn on and off, right? So this evolved in like deer. So if you think about a deer doesn't worry about paying mortgage at the end of the month. They don't worry about GPA. They don't worry about being alone for the rest of their life. The deer is basically chilling and then responds to its environment. If it sees like a wolf, it runs away and then it kind of calms down. So in most animals, if we look at a 30-day period, they may have an activation of sympathetic nervous system here or here. Oh, I see a deer that I'm sexually attracted to, so I get a spike of it. What happens in human beings is we get prolonged activation. Because if I have a test in 2 weeks, I don't stress about that in 2 weeks. I start stressing today and I stay stressed. So hyperarousal is basically the same thing. It is a elevated triggering of our sympathetic nervous system. So it's not chronic. It just means that, so here's the way that I would put it. So here's a normal human being. And let's say that I need a danger signal that is this high. So if my danger signal hits this point, actually, let's do it this way. So let's say here's our stress response. I'm going to redo this, chat, because this is done wrongly. And here's our danger. So let's say danger level 1, danger level 10. Danger level 10 is like there's a tornado flying towards me. Danger level 1 is, I don't know, there's like a someone rings the doorbell, let's say. So normally what happens is we need like a danger level of 7. So as we go over here, as we get a danger level of 7, then we see an increase in the stress response. So this is like for a normal human being. When you have PTSD, what we tend to find is that a danger level of 4 is sufficient to trigger a stress response. So our threshold to trigger the sympathetic nervous system goes way down. It is easy for us to get triggered, right? And we use this term so much in common language nowadays.
Actually, like the face where just the doorbell will trigger me.
And the things
really
that we
bad.
say trigger us, I mean, all kinds of stuff can trigger us. But usually what people are referring to is that a very small dose of exposure will lead to a robust or disproportionate response. So this is the first feature. This, by the way, is very physiologic. So it has nothing to do with your mind or your feelings or stuff. I mean, that's not true, but it has a lot to do with that. But this is like at the level of biology, okay? So the second thing that we see let me think about how to think about this. So this is hyperarousal. Okay. Now, hyperarousal will result in things like avoidance. We'll kind of get to those in a little bit. But now what we're going to talk about is the second level that we're going to focus on is emotions. So the other thing that we see in PTSD is that, in complex PTSD, is that people have a tendency to dissociate. So we've explained this concept before, but it's really important to understand. So our brain has two hemispheres, the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere. The right hemisphere governs a lot of our emotions, and the left hemisphere governs a lot of our analytical capability. Now, this is an oversimplification because we also know that the dorsoparietal area and the amygdala and the limbic system, we have emotional structures on both sides of our brain. So like there's like other ways that this is not really that accurate, but it sort of is. So what van der Kolk, he's a great trauma researcher. I think this was van der Kolk's research. What he noticed is that he basically dug into how people dissociate. So what happens in trauma is that a very low threshold of exposure is necessary for a hyperactive physiologic response. So if we kind of go back to our diagram, I wonder if this is a good way to explain it. So like, I don't know if this makes sense, but like, so we can go from here to here, and then we can kind of top out. But if we look at trauma, what happens in dissociation is we can't keep going up, right? This is the max. This is the top. You can't get any more stress than that. This is maximal activation of the sympathetic nervous system. You can't just keep going up. So what van der Kolk basically noticed is that somewhere around here, I'm just sort of approximating, okay? This triggers dissociation. So the stress level is so high that it's kind of like, you know, I can put wattage through a light bulb. I can increase the amount of watts that go through a light bulb, and the light bulb will get brighter and brighter and brighter until it burns out. So this is what happens in dissociation. Dissociation is usually triggered by a hyperactivation of the sympathetic nervous system. It's like you go all the way around the world, you're heading east, and then suddenly you end up like west of where you started, which is like really weird. So this is what happens in dissociation, is that the signals are so overwhelming, the emotions are overwhelming, the physiology is overwhelming, that it triggers this process of dissociation. Now, what happens in dissociation, a couple of different things happen, but the key thing that we're going to focus on is decreased activity across the corpus callosum. So our right hemisphere is where we experience emotions. Our left hemisphere is where we experience analysis. So as y'all know, when I get emotional, my analysis starts getting messed up. And so our brain is like, I can't handle these emotions. I can't handle this. Is too much activity, too much activity, too much activity. And there's even some studies. Let me see if I can find this. I don't think I have this prepped, but let me see if I can find it. Yes. Okay. So what happens, this is super cool, dude. So cool, but fucking weird. Okay. The mechanism underlying this process is understood as being analogous to kindling, which involves the emergence of generalized seizures in response to repeated subthreshold electrophysiological stimulation. In PTSD, similar to the kindling of seizures, the progressive augmentation and amplification of symptoms occurs over time, possibly as the result of neural circuitry associated with emotional memory response becoming increasingly reactive and also expanding into neighboring neural circuits. So I know that probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense to y'all, but let's explain what's going on. So basically what happens in PTSD is we almost get something like seizures, right? It's not really a seizure. But what happens is that there's an activity. So if you think about what a seizure is when you have, normally we have controlled electrical activity. So neuron turns on, second neuron turns on, first neuron turns off, second neuron turns off. This is how it works, right? So it's like I'm sending a signal and it goes from here to there and then we're done. So in a seizure, what happens is we have unregulated electrical activity across the brain. So everyone is just activating each other and activating each other and activating each other. So what people have noticed in PTSD is there is a similar thing going on, where we have this feeding and unregulated upswing of whatever badness is going on. So we have panic attacks, we have re-experiencing, we have flashbacks, we feel overwhelmed, we feel triggered, and then much like a seizure, so after you have a seizure, people have this thing called a post-ictal state, where they're not quite comatose, but they're like sort of semi-conscious, because their brain just shuts off. And so the same thing happens in PTSD, okay, or in trauma, is that you have this overactivation, and then the brain is like, enough is enough, and then we dissociate. We just completely unplug. Now, what happens in dissociation is that we have decreased activity across the corpus callosum. So the emotional center of our brain, which is going absolutely haywire, the emotional hemisphere, which is going absolutely haywire, the left side of our brain is like, enough is enough, we can't handle this, cut off all contact with the right side of the brain. Then we dissociate. So what this feels like is you can watch terrible things happening dispassionately to yourself. The logical part of your brain is like, this is happening, now this person is hurting me, now they're hurting me more, now they're hurting me more, this is painful, period. There's no emotional connection to this experience, okay? So once we dissociate, once this process happens, and this is where I think Van der Kolk coined this term, and apologies to the researchers who coined it if I'm misattributing this.
I lived through
we
this
call this
for
process
so long.
hemispheric lateralization. Now, this creates all kinds of problems because once we disconnect from our emotions, we have all kinds of challenges, okay? So if we look at what is the role of emotion, so emotions do a couple of things.
That's why
Emotions
it was
give us
taking drugs
information.
for so long, dude,
They give us motivation,
to escape.
right? So let me give you y'all an
I
example
didn't
of how
care
they give
about
us information.
anything. I just wanted to
So if
escape.
I walk into a room and everyone is laughing and then they suddenly go quiet and look at me, I feel weird, right? I feel uncomfortable. So like what really happened? Like my logical brain doesn't know, but my emotional brain is like giving me information. When someone calls and cancels on you for the third time and you feel angry, your brain is telling you something, okay? Second thing is emotions give us motivation. So what we find is that when people struggle with trauma, and this is the video that we're going to show you all today. Let me go back to this. So, right, so like the paralysis of initiative of chronic trauma combines with the apathy and helplessness of depression. So what Dr. Herman noticed was that when people have been traumatized, they become like listless. Like these veterans come back from their POW camps and they don't feel like doing anything. They just kind of sit around, they kind of exist, they have no drive, they have no passion. And if we look at like where does drive and passion come from? It comes from our emotions, right? Well, like I'm not going to stand for this anymore. I want to go achieve something. I want to be the best. I want to do better. I want to be free. I want to relax. These are all emotional things. The whole problem that a lot of people see in our generation, we're talking like millennials, Gen Z, Gen Alpha, is that we're told that we should do a certain thing. So our logical brain is like, I should study for this test instead of playing a video game. But my emotional brain is not motivated to do it. I'm motivated to do something else. So emotions are a big part of motivation. And when we disconnect from our emotions, we lose information, and then we also lose motivation. But there's more at play. It turns out that when we lose our emotions, okay, we also lose our sense of identity. Now, the question is why? So let's understand what your identity is.
Oh my god, dude.
So identity is formed through stringing together emotional events. So if I ask someone who thinks that they are a loser, and I say, what makes you a loser?
Okay.
Let's say there's someone who's 25 years old. So they've been on this earth for like 8,000 days, okay? Yeah, so like way more than 10,000 days. So let's say someone has been on this earth for 10,000 days. And if I ask them what makes you a loser, they're not going to look at their average experience on a day-to-day basis. That's not what makes them a loser. 8,000 out of the 10,000 days, my day was relatively normal and like nothing good happened, nothing bad happened. I was just straight chilling. What makes them a loser is the emotional moments in their life. That moment that I asked this girl out to a dance and she laughed in my face and then told the whole school about it, and then everyone made fun of me for the week before school ended. And so 7 days out of 10,000 becomes this person's identity. The flip of it is also true in terms of positive things, right? So when I ask someone, hey, like, how do you think about yourself? Then someone says, I'm a really strong person who's just trying to do good in the world. And then I ask them, like, how did you develop that identity? Like, what makes you say that? Tell me about your life. And they will tell you emotional moments in their life. Once again, it's not about the 10,000 days that they've been alive. It's not like that they ate PB&J every single day. Like, that's not a part of their identity. What makes your identity is a string of emotional experiences. This is why people who like survive cancer, like it becomes a part of their identity. Like, I am a cancer survivor, because it's an emotionally grueling experience, right? Joining the military, you know, in my case, right? So like I failed out, and like those were very powerful emotional experiences. Getting into med school, like I remember the day that I still remember the day before Thanksgiving, I got a call from the dean of the medical school after 3 years of applying, saying that, hey, I've been accepted, and I wanted to call. I've been accepted in med school, and I wanted to call so that you know weren't worried and you had like a happy Thanksgiving. And then I called my dad and I called my grandmother, and it was like very joyous and tearful and things like that. And you know, anyway, it was a very powerful moment for me. We can go into more detail if y'all want. But my point is that if we look at what makes our sense of identity, it is like strings of emotional experiences. This breakup, this marriage, the birth of this child, landing this job, you know, surviving a shark attack, like these are the moments, getting this award. It's emotional experiences that create our sense of identity. So the moment that you start dissociating, you lose your sense of identity. Then you're simply existing. You're not living. So what we see in complex PTSD is disturbances of self-organization, and it starts with emotional dysregulation. So when your emotions are dysregulated, when you can't control them, you can't really make sense of the world, right? So like there are times where your emotions get out of control, and then you end up triggering dissociation. So now it's like hyperactive emotion followed by dissociation. There's no way to make sense of that. It's just like it's like someone is like, there's a difference between like painting a painting and taking a bucket of paint, throwing it on a canvas, and then burning the canvas. This is the best analogy that I can come up with in this moment of the difference between emotional dysregulation and disorganization. There's no order to it. It's just emotions out of whack followed by unplugging the whole experience. So when we have this process, then we lose our sense of identity. And this is what we see in CPTSD. So if we look at diseases like, or diagnoses like borderline personality disorder or narcissistic personality disorder, what we find in these diagnoses is a disturbed sense of self. So in someone with BPD, they do not have a stable sense of self. So what does this mean? So what this means is that if I'm walking down the street and someone insults me and says, hey, Dr. K, you're bad at games, their opinion of me, whatever it is, or I'm great at games. They're saying I'm the best human being on the planet and I'm so good at video games. Whatever their opinion of me is, their opinion exists out here. And my opinion of me exists in here. And as they say one thing and I say another thing, these two things conflict. So if enough people say this to me, then my sense of self will change. So if you have like this entitled little prick of a kid, how do they become entitled? Because too many times their parents or the people around them are telling them over and over, they're getting signals from the outside world, you can do whatever you want. You can do whatever you want. You can do whatever you want. So you internalize this. And on the flip side, if you get told the opposite, if you have someone who has low self-esteem because they're told you're a piece of shit, you're a piece of shit, you're a piece of shit, then that becomes internalized. So you have a stable sense of self, and then you have the outside world's opinion of you. So what happens in borderline personality disorder is that their stable sense of self disappears. It's not stably high or stably low. So remember that people like who have, let's say, a mood disorder like major depressive disorder, they may have a stably low sense of self. But in BPD, the sense of self is absent. So what that sort of means, not absent, but it's not well formed. So what that sort of means is if people are treating me well, I feel great. I am a good person if people are treating me well. And if they're treating me poorly, then I'm a shitty person. This is an unstable sense of self. And now if you sort of think a little bit about complex PTSD, and BPD, so this is kind of where...
So many things just click.
So we know that if you have BPD, you have a unstable sense of self. Which, by the way, if y'all haven't seen our video on BPD, apparently it's really good. So like I was just like, someone told me recently that has a ton of views and we've gotten really positive feedback about it, so watch it. We've got PTSD over here with our arousal, vigilance, and avoidance. And then we have CPTSD, which is these plus this DSO, which is disturbed self-organization. So emotional dysregulation.
I'm quite sure
an S there, but GG, get wrecked.
I got CPTSD as the way they are describing it.
Identity issues.
Like I would get
and relationship issues.
Diagnosed with this if I would have been psychologically
So what we kind of see is that like
evaluated.
BPD has these two, but BPD doesn't have these. So BPD, so now like this is really important to understand. CPTSD is this plus this. BPD is just this without this and then maybe some additional stuff. Does that make sense? So we know that trauma can cause this if it's one time. If it's chronic, causes this. And if it's chronic, causes this. But depending on the nature of the trauma and the frequency and your genetics and stuff like that, like it kind of changes the manifestation.
BPD is bipolar. Or what is he talking about? I didn't get it. Bipolar disorder. I haven't looked into bipolar disorder. Is that I'm not gonna say anything about it. That's what we're gonna look into next. I wasted so many years. But as I'm listening to this, I'm thinking I wasted time, and then at the same time I think it was not a waste, it was just my escape, and I couldn't have coped any other way. I was gonna unalive for all of my life since I was 10. This is why. And it took a bunch of work to get to the point where I am now. You know how many other factors are going in there as well? With my heritage and racism, experiencing racism since I can think. And still am. It's always the same. I'm so mad. I'm so mad right now. At my parents, so mad. You know what's the worst thing? When I tell you about these things, and you don't even know half of what happened to me in terms of domestic abuse, psychological abuse. I have a little sister 1 year younger than me, and she also got it very rough. She's going through the same thing, and she took it much more severe because where we come from and the surroundings and stuff, females are just, they have it worse. Right now I want to scream and cry. But I cried so much already. There's nothing I can change about it. It's all that I can do is like understand it more, and I'm getting closer every day. Getting madder every day. Mad at my parents, mad at how unfair. School also, same thing. They said it's my fault. I got kicked out of 2 schools. I can't even remember properly. 2 schools, maybe 3. I changed schools a lot. And you know what? I still finished with the highest degree that you can get. But it took time. I had to get kicked out and then do nothing for a year or 2. I lived for a whole year and a little more. I was living with art students in their like working space. And then more shit happened after that, and then eventually I would pick up school again. From my own strength, dude. And I finished with the highest degree. what could have I become if I had a better childhood? Just a little better. Just a little bit. This makes me so angry. It all makes sense now. From A to Z, everything is just clicks. That's why this, that's why that. There needs to be a psychic evaluation for people wanting children, honestly. And if you fail, cut off their fucking testicles, man. Cut them off. Same goes for women. Tie the tubes. I'm so angry right now. I'm so mad. I got tears in my eyes. The moment I got the chance to leave my home, I ran. And I never looked back and never regretted. I think I was like 19 or 20, so 15 years ago. And then I was on my own, exposed to the harsh reality of having to work, pay bills, all this kind of shit. All the while I was just disassociated. That's how it was. That's how I felt. There's just anger. Just anger. Everything is whatever I think about now, every interaction where I would get the bad end of the stick, I'm just so angry. It's so unfair. Any interaction, relationship, evaluation, school, jobs, love, everything is so unfair. I didn't know better. I didn't know anything. All I knew was I wanted what other people have, right? What you see in the movies. The way I survived was just video games and drugs. I spent all my money for weed before I would buy food. weed and alcohol. And whenever I was going outside with, of course, you get the wrong friends doing that. Whenever we would go outside, I was the first one to take more than whatever there was available. The most ludicrous shit. Yeah, I didn't give a damn. I didn't think about tomorrow at all because I didn't care. Because I was on the way to unalive anyways, right? So unfair. Just anger. I don't know. I'm so angry. You can imagine what I would do to certain people if I would see them now. But lucky for them, they are hiding in another country. You know who I'm talking about. I'm not saying more because I don't want anything to be on record. You know the phrase, when you're out for revenge, dig two graves. That is so powerful and so true. It's so honest. I'm very proud of myself because the way I went through life was always with honor. I would never talk bad behind people's back and stuff, right? Langer Schlange, was geht? I would always, I would always be honest in relationships. Never cheat. There were a few occasions where I would know they have a boyfriend and I didn't care, but because I was gonna be their boyfriend. So just mentioning for full transparency in regard of how my honor system was working. Always look out for other. I have like zero narcissistic traits, like negative narcissistic traits. If people owe me money, it could take a while, but I'll give back. When I was very young, I was lying a lot because my mother taught me how to lie and to lie, always to lie. Ridiculous, imagine. And at some point, I stopped lying forever. Never have, and not even like white lies. My white lies are like white lies. Never. So that's why I'm so proud of myself. And what does it do for me? The little people I have left in my life, I do value them a lot. And I do believe they value me too. So that's my price. And then at some point it became, I'm always telling what is on my mind, always being truthful. At some point this became a toxic trait because I would disregard the feelings of people. I would say something that has to be said, but it would hurt other people. And then that would be seen as toxic. Oh, so many occasions I remember. Especially in gaming. You know, when you think about gaming, why do you game? You just want to have fun, right? But I would be playing PvP, mostly arena. It's always a minimum you have to play with one other person. I would flame the shit out of everybody. But because that's all I knew, also I got flamed all the time. And it wasn't like just cussing at people randomly for no reason or something, right? It was just being honest, like pointing out their mistakes as if I had no mistakes. But I mean, goddamn, I was number fucking one in all fucking brackets. Langer Schlangen. Was geht ab? Was machst du? Warum kämpfen wir nicht? Honestly, the little people I have left in my life, I'm gonna show them how much they are worth to me whenever I can. Life is too short to be angry, mad, to have fake honor, not to forgive if somebody is asking to be forgiven. I just wanna create good moments and just give love. I wanna make other people feel special, feel good about themselves. I would never wanna hurt anybody ever again. It's so rough, man. I had this group therapy session. The question was, how did your trauma impact your ability to trust? I can't trust anything, anybody, nobody. especially nowadays, I'm getting messages, let's say on Instagram. I don't know who you are. Your profile is fake, I think. Every time. Anyone who messages me. It doesn't matter what is the message. You are fake, I don't trust you. And you cannot prove me wrong unless you have like some big online presence and are live so that I can see you, you know, whatever, like shoe on head kind of thing. And in the real world, it's just trust as much as you need to survive. And then there is so many other factors. In my workspace, it is a dog eat dog world. Very rough. In finance, oh my god. Everything is on maximum limit of its how do I say? Everything is just cranked to the max, dude. All that's left is just survive and feel good and be able to sleep with your knowing what you've done and therefore being a good person, right? So the past 2 days, I'm waking up with a still depressed mood, but I'm going to bed with a smile on my face. So just thinking about these things, looking videos like this, looking this up, thinking about it, it's helping for sure. Just understanding is helping a lot. Talking to other people, seeing other people having the same issues helps me a lot. Sadly, but that's how it is. This is all exhausting as fuck. And there's layer on layer on layer. Society, expectations. And depending on what gender you are and what culture you're from, you have it even worse. That's why I'm working out for so long, for so many years. To be strong physically, so nobody can fuck with me, you know? And nobody can. But it's never enough. But that is, I guess, the reason why. Next to the sense of wanting to be just healthy and enjoying being healthy and strong. I think I get myself a dog, like an emotional support animal. Dog is your best friend. Maybe I can give love. In that way. Could be an idea. I don't know where I'm at right now with anything. This has just triggered me so much. It's the truth. I must have CPTSD because the constant was there for sure. At the time, since I can think, I became my trauma, like he says. And there's some messed up stories, guys. I can tell you some domestic abuse stories. Holy F. When you try to make people understand, it's too much for them and they leave you. Who can blame them? I don't know. I really don't know. Right now, I just feel a void and anger. You know, when I was younger and didn't have this neck condition as severe as it is right now, I was able to do martial arts, and I was doing martial arts like judo, taekwondo, MMA since I don't know, like since I'm 7 or 8 years old. So there was a way to vent, but I can't anymore, and just working out, beating up the weights does not count. So I'm thinking, what can I do just to vent? I was in a metal band, that was good. Same thing, you vent your anger. I have to channel this into something positive. How? What could I have become, man? Let's listen to the end of this. So he's gonna go about treatment and recovery.
So the reason I think this lecture is super important is because I am seeing this as its own independent set of the cluster of symptoms grow in the population. More and more people are having problems with this without necessarily this or this. Okay? So what happens in CPTSD is we have a disordered sense of identity, which then results in all kinds of problems. Okay? So the first thing is in BPD, the way that people feel about me determines the way that I feel about myself. So there's no persistent sense of self to fight against other people's opinions, right? If I'm confident in here, people can bully me and I can fight back. But in BPD, they can't do that. And in the CPTSD, they can't do that because this is not well formed. The reason it's not well formed is because we're so emotionally dysregulated that we do not lay down a foundation of who we are. This also creates all kinds of other problems. So in CPTSD and in BPD, we see that there's a lot of impulsivity. So why is there impulsivity? So on the one hand, there's paralysis of initiation. So people have difficulty getting things started. That's the video that we're going to watch at the end of the deep dive today, by the way. Okay, so we're going to teach everything. So this is like half of our community struggles with this. I have trouble getting started. And it's so cool that the research on trauma helps us understand why your brain has difficulty getting started. So we have difficulty getting started, and then we also have impulsivity, very common in complex PTSD. And the question is why? So impulsivity is the desire to do something for a little while, right? So it's like, I'm impulsive. So impulsive is not inaction, it is temporary action. It is sudden action. And so what we see a lot is people have difficulty with follow through, right? I can't stay consistent. Why? So if you look at where consistency comes from two places, the environment outside you. If you have an environment that is structured, then you will be consistent, right? So like, let's say you're in prison. And like, I used to have patients who would tell me, oh yeah, I had such big problems with insomnia. And I was like, what worked for you? And he's like, going to prison. I don't have insomnia anymore. And I was like, why not? And he's like, well, I have no choice. I have no cell phone. I have to go to sleep at the same time. I've been here for 3 years, for 365 days, for 3 years in a row. I've gone to sleep at the same time and I wake up at the same time. Like, I have no choice. But if we do not have a horribly structured life, then our consistency comes from our sense of identity, right? Why do you go to the gym every day? Because I want to be in shape. I want to be healthy. I enjoy it. Why do you play games every day? I enjoy them. Why do you play games every day? I don't know. I hate them. So your sense of self is what gives you a drive in a direction over time. So I've worked with a couple, but I'm thinking about one Olympic athlete many years ago. And so like when I talk to this person, like, how did you, I was curious. I was like, this is the first person I worked with who was an Olympic athlete. I was like, how did you become an Olympic athlete? Like, tell me about that. Like, what's that like? And it's like a very strong sense of self that drives you forward so that when there are setbacks, when RNG happens, that strong sense of self keeps you focused on the task at hand. So what is impulsivity? So impulsivity is a combination of emotional dysregulation and a lack of sense of self. So when my emotions arise over here and I don't have a grounding from in here, I'll jump over there. And as the emotion disappears, I stop doing it because I have no driving force from in here. So another very common feature of CPTSD is impulsivity and paradoxically paralysis of initiation. So how can those two things go together? Well, because remember, it's not, the problem with paralysis of initiation is that you want to start something, but you can't bring yourself to start it. So if you're someone who really struggles to get things started, what you will find is that there's a correlation between getting things started and being impulsive. Because in both cases, you're not in control. In both cases, in one case, you can't drive over your emotions. And in the other case, your emotions are taking advantage of you and they're making you impulsive. And now you do this and now you do that. So these are common features in CPTSD. And they have to do with a combination of lack of identity and emotional dysregulation. Now we get to the third thing, which is relationships. So people who have CPTSD have difficulty in their relationships. Now, this is where we get to some really cool neuroscience. So,
who would have thought, huh?
I think it's here. Okay, let's actually take a look at some science to kind of support these points, okay? So, what we find in people who have CPTSD is that they have poor emotional awareness. So they're not aware when they're feeling emotions, right? This is a result of like this dissociative pathway or hemispheric lateralization. So, and as emotional awareness enables increased self-reflection and regulation of affective states, it is often considered a cornerstone of emotion regulation. So let's understand this for a moment. See, you can't regulate an emotion unless you're aware of an emotion. And as we dissociate and we numb ourselves to our emotions, then we can't regulate them. Now, this is very important to understand. When you numb yourself to an emotion, it doesn't mean that the emotion is inactive. It just means that you're not aware of its activity. So what happens when someone dissociates is that they don't feel any emotion, but that part of their brain doesn't completely shut off. It is still active. We're just not aware of it. So people who struggle with CPTSD will be less emotionally aware at some times and also paradoxically hyper emotionally aware at other times. Okay? So we're not going to go into the neurobiology of emotional self-awareness. I think that's a bit too detailed. But let's talk about this. Okay? The neurocircuitry underlying emotional numbing in PTSD. So increased emotional numbing symptoms predicted decreased brain activation within the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex during imagery of both positive and negative social scripts, consistent with the role of dorsomedial prefrontal cortex in higher order reflective and metacognitive aspects of emotional functioning. So we'll explain what that means in a second. I just want to read this too. So the development of neural circuitry facilitating blah, 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 may therefore be disturbed in PTSD, leading to the difficulties these individuals often have in reflecting on, interpreting, and acting in accordance with emotion. A patient suffering from PTSD related to prolonged childhood abuse summarized feelings of emotional numbing in the following statement. It's like a blank. I think about my kids and I feel nothing for them. I'll be sitting there feeling confused and numb, and I wonder what I'm supposed to be feeling. It's like dead space. And when that happens, I have trouble using words, finding my words, and I can't talk. So let's understand how you can have numbness and feel emotionally dysregulated. This is what we mean by dysregulated. Dysregulation doesn't just mean hyperaction. It also hyperactivity. It also means low levels of activity and high levels of activity at the same time. And this is where the neuroscience becomes important. So as we look at the neuroscience of CPTSD versus PTSD, we find that there's actually different places that emotions come from in the brain. And it turns out that the CPTSD affects different regions. Okay, so now we're going to get into the neuroscience. So we have our amygdala, and then we have this dorsomedial prefrontal cortex. Now remember, as we looked at this paper, we saw that decreased activation within the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex, okay? So this is like a different region. So most of the time when we talk about emotions, what most people, especially pop neuroscientists like myself, will talk about is the amygdala. This is the fear center, the survival center, the anxiety center of the brain. Fear, anxiety, survival. And what we find in people with PTSD is that this is hyperactive. So like think about how fucked this is, okay? I want you to think about this. This is so fucked. Pardon my language. So here we have, presumably a man or woman, I'm not sure, who is emotionally dysregulated, so has like panic attacks and stuff like that, has hyperarousal, and then when they look at their kids, they feel confused and numb. So this is not fair. So we feel confused and numb to our positive emotions, but we have a hyperactivity of our negative emotions. Like, how is that fair? Panic and anxiety and fear we can feel normally or even at hyperactive levels, because remember in PTSD we're aroused. But love and things like that I can't feel. So this is something very important to understand. The amygdala is where we feel fear and anxiety and survival stuff. But a lot of our positive emotions, a lot of our other emotions come from other parts of the brain, like the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex. And so what we see in complex PTSD is specifically a deactivation of those parts of the brain. We see a deactivation of the positive emotional circuits of the brain, which is actually the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex, while we see a hyperactivation of the amygdala, which is our fear center. Now, the reason I think this is important is I see this in a lot of people who do not have CPTSD. I see a hyperactivation of our fear for the future. The world is going to hell. I'm screwed. I'm going to be alone. Today is Friday, so we have a bunch of posts on our subreddit about how everyone is hopeless. And yet they have a hyperactivation of their negative emotions, but a hypoactivation of their positive emotions. How is this fair? It's not. Now we understand the neuroscientific mechanism, right? It's because not all emotions come from the same place. And what we see in CPTSD is hypoactivation of the dorsomedial part of the brain. So this is where, look, Positive emotion, dorsomedial prefrontal cortex. Negative emotion was also kind of in the same place. Anyway, it's kind of weird. The amygdala, I think, is usually over here. But, yeah, it's also weird because this person's backwards. Anyway, so we may experience some negative emotion there. It's complicated. So now what we're going to do is talk a little bit... okay, so that's emotional dysregulation. Okay. Now let's talk a little bit about self-awareness and identity, okay? So specifically during traumatic memory recall, increasing severity of trait alexithymia, we talk a lot about alexithymia, which is emotional color blindness, was associated with reduced activity within the ventromedial prefrontal cortex and anterior insula. Okay, we talked about kindling. So I think we already covered this. Okay, now let's talk about identity, right? So remember we said that this disturbs our sense of identity. Individuals with PTSD often exhibit disturbances in self-referential processing. Johnson et al. Proposed that the ability to reflect upon oneself requires a robust sense of self, which has been described as a collection of schemata regarding one's abilities, traits, and attitudes that guides our behaviors, choices, and social interactions. So we kind of already explained this, but does this make sense? Like the sense of self is a collection of ideas, they use schemata because it's not quite an idea, about your abilities, your traits, and your attitudes. I like tacos, I don't like hot dogs, I'm good at this game, I'm bad at studying, I'm a dog person, I'm a cat person, I'm a night owl, I'm a morning lark. Like we have like this kind of stuff. And then also when we have these kinds of beliefs about ourselves, they affect our behaviors, choices, and social interactions. Right? So if I'm a gamer, if I identify as a gamer, I'm more likely to play more video games. So now let's understand the mechanism through which people with CPTSD have difficulty doing this. Neuroimaging studies suggest that self-referential processing is partly mediated via cortical midline structures. We're going to focus on the anterior cingulate, okay? And the temporal poles, temporoparietal junction and temporal poles. Let's see if that, no. All right. So this is where basically what happens is the parts of our brain that give us our sense of self, which is the anterior cingulate, the default mode network, and our temporoparietal regions of the brain. These parts are impaired in CPTSD. So our sense of self does not function quite the same way. Now, if y'all remember at the very beginning, I said, if you electrically stimulate the temporoparietal junction, this is not the junction, but those regions of the brain are impaired in CPTSD. If I electrically stimulate the temporoparietal junction, I will trigger an out-of-body experience. So what is an out-of-body experience? An out-of-body experience is an experience of my consciousness existing outside of my body. Right? So this is the part of the brain that governs like my experience of self. And if it is impaired in some way, my sense of identity will not form well. If my sense of identity does not form well, that'll result in problems in terms of behaviors, the choices that I make, etc. The last dimension that we're going to talk about is relationships. So in order to have a relationship, we must have a sense of identity, because a relationship is something between me and you. There's a chunk of you in there and there's a chunk of me in there. But if my sense of identity is disturbed, my capacity to have a relationship with another human being is impaired. Practically what this looks like is something very similar to BPD, where when you have CPTSD and you try to have a relationship with someone else, like, you don't add a whole lot to the equation. I'm not saying that you don't factually add value to the relationship. What I'm saying is that your personality does not enter and shape the relationship in the same way that someone who has a well-formed sense of identity does. You know, sometimes what this means is that you become a doormat, you become a people pleaser, you don't really have a whole lot of strong opinions, you become a chameleon. These are all three different variants of how CPTSD shapes our relationships. In BPD, like sometimes, like, so I worked with some women who have BPD, and the people that they date feel like they found the perfect partner for the first couple of weeks. Because whatever their partner is into, they're into. And like, I've had friends, male friends, who've probably dated women with BPD, and I've heard the way that they describe them. They'll say like, oh my God, this person is amazing. She's into like anime, and she's into this, and she hates wine, and she loves beer. She loves matcha, but she hates coffee. She's like perfect. She's like a female version of me, and she's hot. And so they'll say things like this, and the gender roles can be reversed too, absolutely. But what happens is when we don't have a sense of self, it becomes hard to have a relationship because we absorb the other person's things. So in BPD, it's more about absorption of the other person. In CPTSD, it doesn't have to be that way. We can see doormat, we can see people pleaser, because I don't have a sense of identity. And once we have these doormat and people pleaser tendencies, we also open ourselves up for more toxicity in relationships, because I don't advocate for myself. right? Because you're better than I am. I don't have a sense when you treat me like crap. I do not have something in here that instinctively rebels. So if you have a well-formed sense of identity and someone treats you like crap, you recognize that you deserve better. And that idea that you deserve better, where does that idea comes from? It comes from a sense of self. Just think about the mechanics of this, okay? Think about the language that I'm using. When I say I deserve better, there is a stable conception of what this quantity of I deserves. I don't deserve $10 million. I don't deserve $0. I deserve $100. That is based on your identity. Now, in the case of narcissism, that identity is too high. So what that means is if anyone, remember this, root of narcissism is actually insecurity. So if anyone gives you even 1% less than you deserve, you become prickly like a porcupine. And you're like, I deserve better. And it's like, bro, like you got what you deserve. This is crazy. Like I did everything that I could for you. And the opposite is also true, where when you don't deserve any, like when you don't have a sense of self, then how can you deserve if you have no no stable sense of self and what you deserve? So this creates all kinds of problems in relationships, and we see that in CPTSD, right? So the disturbances of self-organization result in emotional dysregulation, hyperactivity using something like a kindling mechanism, especially in the negative emotional regions of the brain, where you have this sub-threshold electrical activity that then activates. It's like you're just going about your day, and then suddenly you feel intensely sad, and you're like, what the fuck, right? You don't actually think that way, because it's normal for you, but people outside of you look at you and they're like, I don't understand why this person just gets so upset so randomly. And they do what they can to help. And if you know people in your life who do this, right, they just go into funks for like very intensely for a day, and you're like, what's wrong? And they're like, I don't know, or nothing. And then if you're like a normal person, right, I don't mean that in a judgmental way. I mean that if you have a brain that is not developed like this, you look at this and you say, tell me what's wrong. And they say nothing's wrong, and they're fucking crying their eyes out. And you're like, what the fuck? Because, and the thing is, in their case, they're right. Nothing is wrong. This is what's wild about trauma. See, when you look at someone like that and you think there must be something wrong. Why? Because in order for you to cry that hard, you need something that is so powerful that it overcomes your sense of self and makes you cry really hard. In their case, they have a fucking seizure-like activity in their amygdala that just dysregulates their emotion, and they're crying for no reason. It's not no reason. It's all kinds of weird emotions that have been stored up. They're not relevant to the circumstances at play. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So it's like the brain is different. And this is what's so sad when I work with these people is like they don't understand this. They're like, what the fuck is wrong with me? And this is a crazy thing. There is something wrong with you. That's not a bad thing. It's not fundamental. I mean, it's sort of fundamental, but the brain is activating in a different way. The rules that the brain is playing by are different. That's what's wrong with you. There's nothing wrong with your personhood. The way that your neurons are activating are closer to a seizure, which is why you have this disrupted emotional regulation. And you just feel things so intensely, and it comes out of nowhere, and it's so confusing, and it's so debilitating. Okay? And then there's also dorsomedial numbness, which results in like not being able to like do things like feel spontaneous love for your kids and all that kind of stuff. It's all super sad and super debilitating. CPTSD is a really bad diagnosis. Good news is that you can get way better, right? So this is not, it's not your destiny. So the cool thing, and I guess we'll get into this now, is that we actually know we have a sequence of things that you can do that will sustainably get you better. Now there are a couple of good things about treatment. The first thing to understand is that trauma.
So he's coming to the treatment points now. I've done so much work. It's crazy. That's why I'm here still on this planet. And I do feel like I have a sense of identity by now. It's just completely messed up. But I do know what I want and who I am and what I deserve, I believe. I think we watch the rest tomorrow. I need to digest a bunch of stuff right now. I got